Chapter 5. Mysterious Outbreak. In the summer of 1906, New York banker Charles Henry Warren rented a spacious country house in Oyster Bay, a village on Long Island. Located in a neighborhood of beautiful homes, the house was surrounded by gardens, lawns, and porches. It was the perfect place for the Warren family to enjoy a relaxing summer away from the city's stifling heat, humidity, and foul odors. The rich and powerful were drawn to Oyster Bay, particularly after Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901. Roosevelt had vacationed in the town when he was a teen in the 1870s. As an adult, he built a house there, which he called Sagamore Hill. The Roosevelt family had made it their home since the mid-1880s, and now it was the summer White House. But the Warren family's idyllic summer in famous Oyster Bay took an unexpected and alarming turn. On August 27th, a rainy Monday near the end of their stay, the Warrens' daughter became feverish and weak. A doctor was called immediately, and he broke the bad news. She had typhoid fever. The family was shocked and dismayed, yet more was to come. Within a week, Mrs. Warren, a second daughter, 2 maids, and a gardener fell ill. Out of 11 family members and servants staying in the house, 6 developed the awful typhoid symptoms. 2 were so sick that they had to be taken to the hospital, though none of the victims died. Such an outbreak was rare in Oyster Bay. No other cases occurred during the months before and after the Warren household became ill. Typhoid fever seemed to be centered on that single house. In September, the owners of the house, Mr. and Mrs. George Thompson of New York City, hired inspectors to examine the property and its water supply. The results revealed no definite explanation for the outbreak. This wasn't good enough for the Thompsons. Their house was an investment, and they planned to rent it again. With the cloud of typhoid fever hanging over it, the house might as well have a quarantine sign on the front door. The Thompsons wanted to find out the cause of the outbreak and fix it. That required hiring a first-rate expert, someone with a reputation to assure potential renters that the house posed no danger. They contacted George Soper. The Search for Answers. After completing his work in Ithaca in 1903, Soper had continued to build his reputation as an epidemic fighter. He investigated typhoid outbreaks throughout the Northeast and advised stricken communities on ways to end their epidemics and prevent new ones. Desperate to solve the mystery of their Oyster Bay house, the Thompsons gladly paid his fee. Soper's first step in solving the Thompsons' problem was to gather as much information as possible. Several weeks had passed since the outbreak, but he was able to review the earlier inspection results. Next, he took the train from Manhattan to Oyster Bay to examine the scene for himself. When he arrived, he checked the usual causes of typhoid outbreaks, as he had in Ithaca. The most important question, Soper later wrote, was how the first case occurred. The Warrens reported that nobody who became ill had been away from the village all summer. Soper interviewed the 3 doctors who practiced in Oyster Bay. They confirmed that the only cases they had seen were in the Warren household. Focusing on the house, Soper studied the most common source of typhoid bacteria, the water supply. The drinking water came from a deep well on the property. It was a safe distance from the servants' outhouse and from 2 cesspools that collected waste from the family's indoor toilet. All had been cleaned out in the spring, just a few months before the outbreak. Soper read the water purity reports made by 2 separate laboratories shortly after the outbreak. The results came back clean with no bacteria. If the water supply wasn't the source, maybe typhoid bacteria had been in the household's food. Soper asked the Warrens about their diet that summer. The family's milk came from the same dairy used by other residents of Oyster Bay. That eliminated typhoid-contaminated milk, which often causes outbreaks. Another possibility was that raw foods, such as fruits and vegetables, carried the bacteria. But everyone in the household, Those who became sick and those who didn't apparently ate the same food. Still, as Soper had seen in other outbreaks, people who were exposed didn't always develop typhoid. Perhaps they hadn't ingested enough of the germs, or they had immunity due to previous attack. One of the Warrens mentioned how much they all loved clams. At last, Soper thought he might have found the culprit. Shellfish from polluted waters sometimes contained typhoid bacteria. When he asked more questions, he discovered that no one had eaten clams or other shellfish for 6 weeks before the disease struck. That was too long to have caused the typhoid fever cases. Soper had to throw out his hypothesis. A clue surfaces. So far, he couldn't lay blame on any of the typical sources of typhoid bacteria. But Soper wasn't someone who gave up easily. Keeping in mind typhoid's fever incubation period, he asked the Warrens, did anything unusual happen 1 to 3 weeks before their daughter, the first victim, became sick? Did anyone in the household have typhoid symptoms earlier in the summer? No, they answered to both questions. The Warrens recalled one thing, however. They had changed cooks during the first week of August. Interesting, thought Soper. He realized that the timing was significant. 3 weeks before the first person showed symptoms, he asked what they knew about the cook. Her name was Mary Mallon, the Warrens told him. She was Irish, about 40 years old, an intelligent woman. They had hired her through an employment agency, and she came with fine recommendations. Pleased with the food she prepared, they paid her $45 a month, a good wage for a domestic servant. The family mentioned that Mary had prepared a delicious ice cream dessert with fresh cut peaches. She no longer worked for them, though. The cook had left the household a few weeks after their daughter fell ill. Soper wondered if this woman had been the source of the bacteria. She handled the household's food every day. Most of it was heated, which killed bacteria, but she likely touched uncooked foods, too, like fresh-cut fruit. If she hadn't washed her hands after using the toilet, her fingers might have been covered with typhoid germs. The Warrens said that Mary never became ill, so it didn't appear that she spread the disease while she was sick. At the very least, though, thought Soper, the cook might be able to help him figure out the case of the outbreak. Tracking Mary. The Warrens had no idea where Mary Mallon had gone after leaving Oyster Bay. Several weeks had passed. She could be anywhere, even out of the area. Soper had only one lead to go on, the employment agency that sent her to the Warrens. When he spoke to the agency owner, the man couldn't guess where Mary Mallon was working now, but he was willing to give Soper a list of her references stretching back several years. Soper started to work his way down the list of names. At each household he asked for information about Mallon, including whether anyone had typhoid while she was cooking there. Mallon's employers told him that they had been satisfied with her and considered her a competent cook. She seemed to have no problem finding jobs with well-to-do families. Soper had interviewed housekeepers and other servants. Did they know where they could find her? Few remembered much about Mallon, or they didn't want to tell him. He suspected they were protecting her. Servants who had been associated with her never gave any help, Soper later recalled. Eventually, he traced her employment history back 10 years. In 1897, he learned, a New York City family hired Mallon as their cook. During the summer of 1900, she accompanied them to their vacation home in Mamaroneck, about 30 miles north of Manhattan. When Soper asked about typhoid fever, the family recalled that a visitor had come to stay at the end of August. Within 10 days, the young man developed typhoid. A few days later, Mary Mallon left her job. Soper picked up on her trail again in 1901 and 2 when, for 11 months, she worked for another family in New York City. A month after Mallon began cooking there, a laundress in the household became so ill with typhoid that she had to be hospitalized. By the summer of 1902, Mallon had moved on again. A lawyer from New York City, J. Coleman Drayton, hired her to travel with his family to their main vacation home as the summer cook. The household included 4 family members, 4 servants, and Malin. In mid-June, a servant came down with typhoid. Before long, 7 of the 9 in the house became sick, as well as the local nurse and servant who came in each day to help. Mr. Drayton was spared, perhaps because he had immunity after a previous typhoid attack. Mary Malin didn't become ill either. She volunteered to help Drayton care for the sick, and he paid her a $50 bonus for her trouble. No other typhoid cases occurred in Maine community that summer. Tests of the house's water supply found it safe. The trail gets warmer. Soper couldn't pinpoint where Malin had worked in the months after leaving the Drayton family in 1902, but his search led to another New York City family, the Gilseys, who employed Malin in 1904. After she had cooked for the Gilseys for 9 months, she went with them to their Sands Point, Long Island, summer home. Within 3 weeks, 4 people living in the separate servants' cottage were struck with typhoid fever. One, a laundress, became severely ill, but she survived. None of the victims had worked with Mary Malin before. An investigation at the time of the outbreak found no contaminated drinking water. Soper lost the cook's trail for nearly 2 years until 1906, when she ended up in Oyster Bay with the Warrens. After Malin left there in September 1906, she took a job with the Kesslers in Tuxedo Park, New York, about 40 miles north of New York City. 2 weeks later, the family's laundress was taken to the hospital with typhoid. Local health officials reported there had been no typhoid fever in the town for several years. Soper was too late to find Malin with the Kesslers. She had left the job in October, 2 weeks after the laundress became sick. After 4 months, George Soper had uncovered several outbreaks of typhoid connected to Mary Malin. Only a few had been studied at the time they occurred. In most of those, the blame for the outbreak was put on the first victim, who investigators believed caught the disease outside of the household. They never figured out where any of these people originally picked up the typhoid bacteria. Soper wasn't convinced by this explanation. He had a hunch that Malin was the key to all these outbreaks. In early February 1907, he got a tip. After Malin left Tuxedo Park the previous fall, she had taken a job in New York City. Walter Brown and his family lived in a brownstone house at 688 Park Avenue in a wealthy neighborhood. Mary Malin was their new cook. Soper had finally tracked her down. Chapter 6. A Threat to the City. The satisfaction George Soper felt in finding Mary Malin soon disappeared. 2 members of the Bone household had recently become victims of typhoid fever. A female servant had been taken to the hospital. The second patient was one of Bone's 2 children, a 25-year-old daughter named Effie, a beautiful and talented girl. Soper's investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern. He had traced 8 of the households where Malin worked in the previous 10 years. In 7 of them, someone developed typhoid fever while she was the cook, a total of 24 people. Yet even when other servants fell ill, she never did. The outbreaks had been the only typhoid cases at the time in those neighborhoods or communities. The facts troubled Soper. Mary Malin might be one of the typhoid carriers that German scientist Robert Koch had recently described. Despite being in good health, was she harboring typhoid bacteria in her body and spreading them to others? From a scientific point of view, Soper realized this was an exciting discovery. Malin was the first case of a healthy typhoid carrier ever found in the United States. But from a public health standpoint, it was chilling. Under suitable conditions, he feared, Mary might precipitate a great epidemic. To confirm his suspicions, George Soper needed irrefutable proof that Mallon was the source of the outbreaks. It was possible that her connection to these cases had been an unfortunate coincidence. After all, typhoid fever was widespread in the New York area. In 1905, more than 4,300 cases and nearly 650 deaths had been confirmed in the city. Soper was sure there were many more that hadn't been correctly diagnosed or reported by doctors. He saw just one way to prove that Mary Mallon was the carrier: test her body for typhoid bacteria. Confronting the cook. Soper headed to the Bones Park Avenue home to talk to Mallon. He found her in the kitchen wearing a white apron. A stove warmed the room on a frosty February day. A tall woman of 5 feet 6 inches, Mary Mallon had blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back to her into a tight knot. She looked strong and healthy to Soper, perhaps even a bit overweight. She obviously was neither suffering with typhoid symptoms or recovering from a recent bout. He tried to be tactful when he explained the situation. He assumed she wondered why people kept getting typhoid fever wherever she worked. Hadn't it ever occurred to her that she might have something to do with the outbreaks? I had to say I suspected her of making people sick, Soper recalled. It wasn't her fault, he assured her, but there was a good chance she was spreading typhoid through the food she prepared. He offered to show her how to stop infections others by washing her hands and being careful with her excretions. I thought I could count upon her cooperation in clearing up some of the mystery which surrounded her past, he said later. He hoped Mallon would tell him about other places she worked. I wanted specimens of her urine, feces, and blood, Soper remembered telling her. If she would answer my questions and give me the specimens, I would see that she got good medical attention, in case that was called for, and without any cost to her. George Soper was stunned by Mary Mallon's reaction to what he considered a reasonable request. With her eyes full of hostility, she chased the epidemic fighter out of her kitchen. Seeing her fury, Soper took the hint and fled down the hallway through the iron gate that led to the sidewalk. I felt rather lucky to escape, he later wrote, admitting that maybe he hadn't handled her very well. The surprise visit. Frustrated, Soper decided to try a different approach to get Mallon's cooperation. He had to make her understand her role in the outbreaks. He didn't seem to appreciate how important it was to give him the information and specimens he needed. By asking around, Soper discovered that Mallon had a boyfriend in Manhattan named A. Brehoff. The man lived in a 3rd Avenue tenement room and spent his days in a bar on the nearby corner. Soper sought him out. He persuaded Brehoff to alert him the next time Mallon was coming to visit, but Soper asked Brehoff not to tell her about their conversation. On the arranged evening, Soper went to the tenement. He took along his physician friend and former assistant from the Ithaca outbreak, Dr. Bert Raymond Hubler. The plan was for Hubler to help him obtain the specimens. The two climbed the staircases to Brehoff's room on the top floor, where they waited. Soon they heard Mallon's footsteps in the stairs. When she spotted George Soper at the top, she was first startled, then incensed. Once again, Soper tried to explain that she might be spreading typhoid fever germs. He told her that he meant her no harm. He just wanted a sample of her urine, feces, and blood for testing. Soper's words only made Mary Mallon angrier. In her Irish brogue, she demanded to know how anyone could accuse her of such a thing. She was a clean person, couldn't they see? She worked for reputable employers who wouldn't hire someone who was dirty. She was healthy and always had been. She had nothing whatsoever to do with anyone catching typhoid. Why, in fact, 5 years ago, she had put herself at risk to help cure the family at Dr. Drayton Maine's summer home. George Soper saw that Mallon wasn't going to let him take the specimens. With her curses echoing in the stairwell, he and Hubler retreated down the stairs and into the street, relieved to get away from the outraged woman. Danger to the community. On Saturday, February 23rd, after a 2-week illness, Effie Bone died. The funeral was held at the Bones' home the following Tuesday morning. Soper later wrote that the family was prostrated with grief at the death of their only daughter. Effie Bone was the first fatality that Soper had connected to Mary Mallon, and it raised the stakes. In Ithaca and other cities, Soper had seen the misery brought on by typhoid. This cook could be a threat to every person with whom she had contact. He had tried to reason with her, but he'd failed. Someone with more authority would have to deal with her now. Soper collected his evidence of Mallon's 10-year trail of typhoid fever. On Monday, March 11, 1907, he presented it to Dr. Herman Biggs, the general medical officer at the New York City Department of Health. Soper had worked as a sanitary engineer for the department in 1902. He knew it had the legal power to examine the cook, even taking her into custody if she wouldn't voluntarily provide specimens for testing. If Mary Mallon was a carrier, as Soper suspected, she was a menace to the community. She had to be stopped. The healthy carriers. By the end of the 19th century, scientists knew that typhoid was caused by a bacteria spreading from human to human, but they wondered why typhoid suddenly appeared in areas where no one had been sick with it before. If there was no obvious source of the disease, such as a contaminated water or food, how did the bacteria get there? A clue came during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Typhoid fever broke out among almost every volunteer regiment of the United States training camps, striking 1 in 5 soldiers. Yet not a single soldier with symptoms of the disease had been allowed into the camps. After investigating, a team of U.S. Army doctors concluded that some soldiers who looked and felt healthy must have carried the typhoid bacteria. In their report, the doctors wrote that the specific germ of the disease, when cast out in the stools, feces, may become a source of danger to others. Typhoid spread easily under the often unsanitary conditions in military camps. Soon after, Robert Koch, studying a typhoid outbreak in several German villages, he tested the excrement of the residents using new culturing methods that detected typhoid bacteria. He discovered the germs in people who were not sick. In November 1902, Koch gave a speech to other scientists in Berlin during which he discussed healthy carriers of the typhoid bacteria. These people had recovered from the typhoid fever or experienced such mild cases that they never knew they had it. In most patients, either the body's immune system destroys the bacteria or the patient dies. But in a carrier, the bacteria continue to live and multiply and are periodically discharged in the feces or urine. By 1906, when George Soper began investigating Oyster Bay outbreak, he had read Cook's speech. This led him to track down Mary Mallon, whom he suspected was a carrier. Later studies showed that about half of the typhoid patients give off the bacteria in their feces, and occasionally in their urine, for a month after recovering from symptoms. About 20% still shed the bacteria after 2 months, and 10% after 3 months. Approximately 5% of the recovered patients have Salmonella typhi in their excrement more than a year after disease symptoms are gone. They are the chronic typhoid carriers. 3 times as many women as men harbor the bacteria without becoming sick. Children rarely become carriers. The bacteria usually settle in the gallbladder, where bile is stored. They may also be found in the bile ducts, liver, or kidneys. In some carriers, they remain there for decades, ready to infect others. Typhoid carriers live, on average, as long as anyone else, but they are more likely to have gallstones and may be more susceptible to cancer of the gallbladder, bile duct, and pancreas. One carrier lived to be 101 years old, carrying the bacteria in her body for 80 years without becoming sick.